So why make the romantics? Why was it such an important story for you to tell?
I grew up watching Hindi films. They were a vital part of my upbringing, and shaped, my worldview and also helped me connect, to my mother country. And as a filmmaker, I found myself studying the works of filmmakers from all other parts of the world, but never really, in film school or, as through my career as a filmmaker, really found myself taking that kind of deep dive into the works of the auteurs from my own country. And I wanted to do something about that. I wanted to do something that was sort of looked at Indian film, obviously, through a nostalgic lens, but also through the lens of Indian cinema and Hindi cinema being a major contributor to the global cinema canon. And Yash Chopra seemed like the perfect lens to explore that because of the longevity of his career and the fact that he worked across so many different genres, and his films really defined for so many of us what Hindi cinema is.
Yes. And from conception to execution, how did the idea begin, and what were some of the challenges you faced in bringing it to, creating this entire series out of unlimited resources and his, as you mentioned, longevity of his career? There was so much history to it.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges was definitely condensing, 70 years, dozens of films, dozens of interviews that I did, and all of that archive into 4 1-hour episodes. It's a pretty sweeping story, between Yash Chopra and then eventually, his son Aditya Chopra and the studio and everything happening in India over those years from the time of independence until, almost present day. So it was a lot to put into 4 episodes. And so the editing was the biggest challenge, I would say.
Okay. And how does Yash Chopra's cinema, um, and we see through your series as well, that it wasn't really romance until much later on in his career, after he got married. But how does his cinema resonate with you and the understanding and love for filmmaking that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that really, obviously, like as I, as a young person and a young filmmaker, I kind of my relationship with Yash Chopra's films has taken a few iterations. So when I was a kid, I didn't even realize half the films I was were watching were Yash Chopra films. I just love the movies, and I love seeing, Sri Devi dancing in the Swiss Alps, in a sari, and those amazing songs, and all of that. And then as a young filmmaker, I started to appreciate the craft of his films, and realized, how much he was responsible for crafting, that cinematic language that we identify as, Bollywood or Hindi film today. As I was making this series, the thing that really struck me was Yash Chopra's thought process in terms of the types of films he was making, and the risks that he took, with the films that he made. I mean, when he made Chandani, it was a huge risk. I think we take it for granted now, that those, grand 90s romances, and how defining they were. But Chandani, when it was made at a time when it was really only action films that were playing in the cinema. And, there was no appetite, at the time, or so conventional wisdom went, for romantic films and films with all these songs and, all of that. And he really proved that that was not true, with Chandani. He took a huge risk, financially and professionally, to make that film. And, we're all benefiting from that because that ushered in, the era that I think many of us hold most dear.
Yes. Yeah. And being an LA based as a filmmaker who's like, uh, been brought up and raised here in the US, were you at all nervous or hesitant into, diving into the existence of Indian cinema? Because often people who are based abroad are also called NRIs and have certain perception. So was it easy? Were you nervous? Were you hesitant?
Yeah. I think I was nervous, not just being an NRI, I think in fact, like being an NRI gave me some advantages because I kind of had it both an inside perspective and an outside perspective, so I could, I knew what I didn't know, and I also knew the right questions to ask, I think, and of course, I had an incredible research team, and, we took 3 years to make the series, because so much research and care went into, the making of it. But I think the thing I was the most nervous about was just, could I do justice? I mean, this is, you're making sort of the definitive series on one of the most beloved filmmakers, of our generation, and also diving into some of the films that have really, have the most impact, on us as a culture. And, every decision that was made in terms of what to include, what not to include, was a little nerve-wracking because, inevitably, in order to tell the story, there were going to be films that are beloved that I wouldn't include, for one reason or another. And you also want to make sure that you're doing justice, to the legacy of the person. So that was definitely nerve-wracking, but I'm very encouraged, to see how people are reacting to the series.
Like you said, it had its own advantages as well. Did it like free you of any bias? Because if had this been a filmmaker who was part of the Indian cinema itself, mine would have thought, of asking certain questions and not asking them, asking certain questions. But were you like free of any bias and just, went straight right in with a clean slate?
You can never be free of any bias, that's impossible, no matter what, whether you're a journalist or a filmmaker or what have you, there's no such thing as being free of bias.
Mm.
I think though, what we seek as storytellers, and there's this a spectrum, right? Like in journalism, I think, you try to be as aware of your own biases as possible, so that way you can counter that, with um and in filmmaking, I think you also want to be aware of your biases, but you also, for storytelling, you want to have a point of view, and my point of view is that Yash Chopra is an auteur and he's one of the most significant filmmakers, in world cinema. So I wasn't coming into this to make an unbiased, docu-series or an expose or, anything like that. I came into this to make a film celebrating, or a series celebrating and examining, a filmmaker that has moved me, and shaped sort of my life and my career in such significant ways, but also leave a lot of opportunity open for discovery, and to examine also some of the tougher aspects of it, the low points of his career, the more challenging questions that come up, and sort of that was my goal. So I think lack of bias is a fallacy that I prefer to avoid.
Great. So how challenging was it to get, like, we have about over 30, 35 artists in the series. How challenging was it to get all of them on board and then getting their quotes and then making it fall into a place like a complete series, like nothing seems completely out of place. All the quotes, like, all the frames fit into a flow. So how challenging was it?
It was incredibly challenging. It was, the challenge wasn't getting people to agree to participate in the series, because I think, it's, for the people that I approached, they have a deep personal connection with Yash Chopra and Yash Raj Films, and they were very keen to share their perspective, on that. The challenge was mostly logistical, it was scheduling all those interviews and then, like I mentioned, condensing everything into 4 1-hour episodes.
Yeah. And we see Aditya Chopra finally give an interview, what, maybe after 20 odd years. And we see that even his own nearest and dearest friends refused to actually at one point believe that you managed to convince him to give an interview. How did you manage that?
The question I've answered 500 times. Everyone wants to know. It's, I think, ultimately it was not easy, and it was definitely a boundary, that was drawn very early for me, that the studio, they were on board with what I was doing, and they offered all of the help, that they could in terms of access to materials and, things like that. But they said very early on that, please don't expect, like, make sure you're clear that Aditya won't appear, in the series, because he doesn't do interviews. But I think, over time, when I could show him the scope of what I was trying to do, that this wasn't just sort of a highlight reel of the everyone's favorite films and the, backstories behind those films, that it was actually the story of how, an industry was built. It was the story of a family, meaning their family, that it would really feel like something was missing without his involvement. Um, I think that's ultimately what got him to agree.
You do, like, have to tread a bit carefully because he's popularly known as a man of few words. And did you have to like, be careful about what sort of questions were you asking? If, you weren't pushing any buttons or anything, did you have to be like, very careful and cautious about that?
Actually, no. I mean, he was, once he agreed, initially when I approached him for the interview, I told him like, you don't have to give me permission to use it. Let's just film it. And then, worst case, you'll have it for your personal archives. You can keep it in a vault somewhere, and lock it up. So I don't know if it was that framework or, or just, I mean, in my experience with Aditya is he's very eloquent, he's very easygoing, he's very, he's certainly not like a chatty, person per se, but he's not like a, man of few words in that sense either. There was nothing that was off limits. There was no, I was like anticipating somebody to come and say, okay, these are the things, you could talk about, stick to these points, avoid these points, and nothing like that. I had free reign to ask him whatever I wanted to ask him. And then eventually there was nothing that he, when I did end up editing his interview into the series, there was nothing that he said that you can't use this or that. It was, once he was in, he was in.
Great. And it worked. I mean, it's the most probably exciting part, seeing him speak in the series, because I think people are literally just tuning in to see what he has to say, because he hasn't said anything for a while.
Yeah.
But you touched on the subject of nepotism, a question that we often also, very repeatedly hear and talk about in Coffee with Karan.
Yeah. Yeah.
But was it like really important for you to ask that question and get Aditya's perspective? And or was it because it's such a debate at the moment that it sort of made way into your questionnaire?
It was both, I mean, I don't think you can, especially, seeing as how the series kind of came close, to present times. And given, the family that I chose to focus on, I don't think you can avoid that question. I think it would feel disingenuous, to not address it at all. It is, in one way or another, like it is a factor, in Aditya's career, which he talks about pretty openly. But it's also something that, given the success of Yash Raj films, and given the advantages that Aditya has had, that he has consciously tried to leverage to bring more newcomers, as we say, into the industry, and it just, it's an integral part of the story of Yash Raj films. It's an integral part of the story of, the Chopra family and Aditya Chopra in particular. And it's a valid discussion when it comes to Hindi film, Hindi cinema in the present day. So I didn't want to avoid it at all. I wanted to talk about it, but I didn't want to flatten the debate, or the conversation the way we see it on social media, where it's just people sniping at each other and getting defensive, or provocative for the sake of being provocative. I think, I think nepotism is something that exists in every corner of the world, in every industry since the beginning of time. It's just a natural part of, the human condition in many ways. And again, like it's, when it comes to things like that, I would rather just address it head on than either avoid it or, or pretend it doesn't exist. So that was the reasoning.
If you had to describe Yash Chopra's cinema, his school of thought, in just one sentence, how would you do it?
I guess in one sentence, I would say that Yash Chopra never lost sight of the humanity
Yeah.
of his stories and of his characters. No matter what the genre was, no matter what the setting, no matter what the story, he allowed his characters to be fully realized human beings, flaws and all, and he never judged them. And I think that was his true gift, and I think that's what makes his films endure, even today.
Yeah. I mean, I probably never thought of it that way, but when I watched The Romantics, I figured Yash Chopra was actually fairly progressive for his time.
Oh
Even
yeah.
his movies were pretty progressive for his time. Um, so, what were some of the learnings you took away from the process, his thoughts, his wisdom, from your research on Yash Chopra, and in the process of making this documentary?
Yeah, like I said before, I think from Yash Chopra, in the process of making this film, the thing that I learned the most, was um, about trusting your instincts. He really trusted his instincts, even when he was failing, even when people were telling him, that he was making wrong decisions. And you see that in Aditya as well, in success or failure, they operate on instinct. And I think, in a world of algorithms and data and, all of that, it's an important, at least for me as a filmmaker, it's an important thing to be reminded of, that instinct is important, and instincts are eventually what sort of changes the world. It changes, it shifts culture.
Yeah. And your last outing, Indian matchmaking. It's binged watch, but it's still called hate watch by many people. Like you hate to watch it, but you still watch it. It's garnered a fair amount of criticism as well. And then now you make the romantics. Was it important for you to create a series that would then resonate with a larger section of audience after, Indian matchmaking? Was it like you wanted to get rid of that kind of negativity and create, or was it just because, you didn't think of that at all, and this was something that's been on your mind and you wanted to just do it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Indian matchmaking did resonate with a very large audience all over the world. So it's not like it was some dirty little secret that I'm trying to scrub off of my resume. I love that series. I'm very proud of that series. I think it sparked necessary conversations. Whether people hate watch it or love watch it, if they're watching it, I'm happy. And if it's bringing up conversations that we need to have in our community, I'm happy. And I think a lot of the critique of the show is also a critique of certain aspects of our culture and our traditions. But whatever it is, wherever it's pointed, whether it's pointed at me or whether it's pointed at, our traditions and, the way that we operate, as long as we're having the conversations that are going to help us evolve, as a community, as a culture, and examine, the way we choose to move through the world, I think I count that as a success. So I'm very, for the record, I'm very proud of Indian matchmaking. Romantics had nothing to do with that series. The only connection I would say between those two things is that, a lot of my work is about an exploration of the things that have shaped me, culturally, in terms of the world I live in. And of course, as an Indian woman, as an Indian person, two huge things that shape me and so many of my fellow Indians is, marriage, and the traditions around marriage, and cinema. So, that's probably the only sort of connecting factor between these two projects.
Okay. And what are you hoping the audiences would take away from the romantics, apart from sheer level of nostalgia that we do take away? What are you hoping they would?
Yeah, I mean, I hope people take away, a sense of pride about the craft that goes into our filmmaking. I think, even if you just look at the term Bollywood, like there is an assumption that, or sort of like a stigma that Hindi cinema is derivative, of other movies, of other cinema cultures, it's just singing and dancing and, things like that. But there is a very cultivated and robust cinematic language, and intention behind these films. And they're not just sort of escapist, uh, you know, um, singing, dancing, type of thing. And I hope that people take away a sense of pride about the contributions that we as Indians have made, to global cinema culture, so yeah.
Okay. And I'm just going to ask a last question. What is next on Smriti Mundra's plate?
Next, some sleep and rest. Yeah, I think, look, it's important for me. I spent 3 years on this project. I have, obviously other work, going on, and we have season 3 of Indian matchmaking coming out in the next few months. So there's, a lot. It's been a robust few years. I've been running at full speed for a while, and I think it's important as a storyteller and as a filmmaker to take time to recharge, and allow inspiration to find me, for the stories that I want to tell next. So I think I'm going to probably focus on that a little bit.